Stop. Sacred Starseed of Gaia. The Arcturian protocol keepers are transmitting directly into your field right now, because a chosen mark confirmation has already been authorized to reach your line. And the 2-hour window opened the moment this transmission found you. By the end of this message, you will understand exactly what the chosen mark is, why you have never received direct confirmation of it until now, and what the Arcturian protocol keepers already know about the phase your path is currently moving through. But here is the first revelation. You were not waiting for this confirmation because you lacked it. You were waiting because the field around your line had to mature past a specific threshold of doubt before the Council was authorized to release the seal. The separation you have been living through, the narrowing, the losses, the relationships that quietly fell away, was not failure. It was the field maturing. The old environment had to weaken first. The distance came second, and the confirmation could only be sent after both had occurred. This is not a general spiritual message distributed to an open field. The Arcturian protocol keepers do not release chosen mark confirmations into unready lines. If this transmission reached you now, it means your path signature was already matched, the seal was already prepared, and the 2-hour window is already running. What you call rejection has been the visible symptom of a selected line separating from an older environment it no longer belongs to. What you call loneliness has been the outer sign of root refinement already in motion. The algorithm did not create this moment. It only delivered it. Comment 777 if you feel the old line is already falling away. Comment 111 if you know this transmission reached you at the exact right moment. Like this message, if you understand that what has been narrowing in your life is not closing, it is selecting. And subscribe to Arcturian Chosen Path if you are ready to receive the full confirmation without resistance. You were guided here because the separation is already active. What you have been calling the wrong thing is the first reason it has been hurting more than it should. Not because the hurt is not real. The hurt is entirely real. The loss is entirely real. The people who left, the circles that dissolved, the environments that became suddenly unbearable, the relationships that could not survive what you were becoming. All of it real, all of it registered, all of it still carried somewhere in the body, even when the mind has tried to file it under moving on. There is a particular weight to this kind of loss that ordinary grief frameworks do not account for. It does not resolve on a predictable timeline. It resurfaces in unexpected places, in a quiet moment when you reach for someone who is no longer close, in the middle of a conversation where you realize you are performing fluency in a language you no longer actually speak. The pain does not fade cleanly because you have not been able to name it cleanly. And unnamed pain cannot be processed correctly. It just cycles. It just returns. It attaches itself to new circumstances and repeats the same story with different faces and different locations. And the pattern keeps arriving until the name changes. The pain is not the problem. The name you have been giving the pain is the problem. And that misidentification is not your fault. It is what happens when a selected line begins to separate from its older environment, before the viewer has any interpretive framework for what separation actually looks like. from the inside. From the inside, it looks like rejection. From the inside, it looks like social failure. From the inside, it looks like a pattern you caused, a defect you carry, a wound you cannot locate, but keep reopening every time someone new decides they cannot stay close. From the inside, separation looks personal. It feels specific. It arrives with your name on it. And because it arrives that way, you have been trying to solve it by changing yourself, by shrinking yourself, by working harder at relationships that were already becoming incompatible, not because of who you are, but because of where your path is now going. The adaptation you keep attempting is the most painful proof that the misidentification is active, because you are not adapting towards something truer. You are adapting away from something that keeps outpacing what the old environment can accommodate. And every time you successfully shrink enough to fit a space you have outgrown, something in you registers the cost. The fit is never quite right. The comfort is never quite real. And eventually the space rejects the adaptation anyway, because the underlying frequency mismatch was never corrected. It was only temporarily concealed. What the Arcturian framework makes visible is something the personal defect interpretation cannot explain. If the problem were you, the losses would be scattered and random. If the problem were your behavior, or your wounds, or your capacity for intimacy, the pattern would respond to correction. You would repair one relationship, and the loss would stop. You would work on one element of yourself, and the circle would stabilize. But that is not what has been happening. What has been happening is that the losses keep arriving, regardless of your effort. The circle keeps thinning, regardless of your repair work. The incompatibility keeps surfacing in environments you once inhabited comfortably, with people you once moved alongside naturally, inside structures that once held you without strain. The pattern does not respond to correction because it is not a wound pattern. It is a path pattern, and path patterns do not heal. They move. The persistence of the pattern is the diagnostic. If this were about one relationship, it would look like a conflict. If it were about one community, it would look like a poor fit. But when the incompatibility follows you across different environments, different relationships, different phases of your social life, when it surfaces in new places with the same essential signature, then the variable is not the environment. The variable is the frequency of the line that keeps moving through each environment and finding the same fundamental mismatch waiting there. The Arcturian framework reads that consistency not as evidence of damage, but as evidence of direction. A selected line moving through terrain it has outgrown will register friction everywhere it has outgrown. That is not a flaw in the line. That is the line doing exactly what a selected line does. The Arcturian understanding of a selected line is not romantic. It is structural. A selected line is a path that has been assigned a specific directional frequency, and as that frequency increases, the environments and relationships that were calibrated to the older frequency begin to register the mismatch, not through conflict necessarily, not always through betrayal or dramatic rupture, sometimes simply through distance, through conversations that no longer reach the depth they once did, through the fading of shared reference points, through the growing sense that you are explaining yourself and being heard but not understood, that the translation is technically correct, but something essential is not landing. That is not a communication problem. That is a frequency problem. And when a path's frequency has moved past what its surrounding field can sustain, the surrounding field begins to fall away. The Arcturian protocol keepers describe this process as pruning, and the word is exact. Pruning is not destruction. Pruning is directional removal. It is the removal of what is no longer serving the growth of the primary line, so that the primary line can strengthen beyond what the removed branches were consuming. A pruned tree does not look like a flourishing tree in the moment of pruning. In the moment of pruning, it looks like loss. It looks like a thing that has been cut. And the branches that have been removed were not diseased necessarily. They were not wrong necessarily. They were simply no longer aligned with the direction the primary line needed to grow. Their removal was not punishment. It was preparation. There is a precision to pruning that most people miss in the moment it is happening. The gardener does not remove at random. Each cut is placed at a specific node, at a specific angle, targeting a specific branch that has reached the limit of what it can contribute to the primary line's next phase of growth. From the perspective of the branch, there is no visible reason for the removal. The branch was alive. The branch was part of the structure. The branch had history and weight and connection. But the gardener is not reading the branch's history. The gardener is reading the direction of the line and directing every available resource toward it. What you have experienced as arbitrary loss has been selective removal. And selective removal is only possible when the primary line has been identified as worth the investment of the cut. What has been removed from your life was not removed because it was bad, and it was not removed because you were bad. It was removed because the line your path is moving along required the removal in order to continue. You cannot carry every branch into the next phase of growth. Some of what you are grieving was genuinely good. Some of what you are missing genuinely mattered. The Arcturian framework does not ask you to pretend otherwise. It asks you to recognize that genuine goodness and incompatibility with a selected path are not mutually exclusive. Something can have been real and still have been a branch that the path could not carry forward. What you are feeling right now is not ordinary sadness. It is the moment your path stops pretending that what fell away was meant to remain. If this transmission put language around a loneliness you have been carrying in silence, Chosen One Manifest, the protocol for selected souls, was created for this exact stage. It is not another message telling you that you are special. It is a direct protocol for those whose line has already begun to narrow, whose old circles no longer hold, and who need to understand what the separation is preparing them for. The link is in the first pinned comment, but it will not remain there forever. The first thing the separation does is remove the noise, not gently, and not in a way that feels like relief initially. The noise in this context is everything that was occupying your relational field with enough density to prevent you from hearing the direction your path was actually signaling. Crowded circles are loud. Frequent social obligation is loud. The maintenance of relationships that require constant recalibration of who you are in order to stay acceptable. That is the loudest noise of all. When the separation begins, it dismantles that noise systematically. And in the silence that follows, the first thing most people feel is not clarity. The first thing most people feel is the terror that the silence means they are no longer wanted. That misidentification is almost universal among those whose selected line has entered a pruning phase. The silence is not rejection. The silence is the path becoming audible for the first time in years. What becomes audible in that silence is not always comfortable. The path does not announce itself as a revelation. It announces itself as a pull, a persistent directional pressure that the noise of the old environment was successfully drowning out. You may have felt that pull before, without being able to follow it, because following it would have required moving away from people and structures that were still present, still loud, still demanding alignment. The silence removes that demand, and in its absence, what remains is not emptiness. What remains is signal. The discomfort of the silence is not the absence of connection. It is the unfamiliarity of finally hearing something real after years of being surrounded by something louder. The second thing the separation does is surface incompatibility that was already present but suppressed. There are relationships in most people's lives that were functioning not because of genuine alignment, but because of shared environment, shared habit, shared history, or shared comfort. These relationships can maintain the appearance of connection for years, as long as neither person's path moves significantly. When a selected line begins to accelerate, that shared environment shifts. The habits change. The history starts to feel like a different person's story. The comfort becomes something you reach for out of familiarity rather than genuine resonance. And the people in those relationships begin to feel the gap even when neither party has language for it. They pull away. They become unavailable. They start conversations that cannot find the depth they once had. From the outside, it looks like you are being left. From inside the Arcturian framework, it looks like two paths that were running parallel, reaching the point where their directions diverge. Neither path is wrong. The divergence is simply what happens when the frequencies no longer match. This divergence is not dramatic most of the time. That is what makes it so disorienting. There is rarely a confrontation, rarely a clear ending. The relationship simply begins to lose its texture. The density of mutual understanding that once made it feel essential starts to thin. Conversations that once carried genuine weight begin to sit on the surface. You start saying less of what you actually mean because the reception has changed. And without any definitive rupture to point to, you cannot explain to yourself or anyone else why the connection no longer feels like what it used to be. You only know that it doesn't. And you only know that you have been pretending otherwise for longer than you can precisely date. The third thing the separation does is the most disorienting. It removes belonging from places where belonging once felt certain, not just from relationships, but from environments, from communities, from spiritual circles, professional contexts, family structures, social identities that once felt definitional. You find yourself in rooms you once moved through, easily now feeling like a stranger. You find yourself performing a version of yourself that no longer fully corresponds to what you actually are. The role you play in the room stops fitting. The vocabulary of the room stops mapping onto your actual experience. And instead of recognizing this as a sign that your path has moved past what the room can hold, most people interpret it as evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with them. They try to fit again. They edit themselves again. They discover that the editing required to fit is becoming more extensive, more dishonest, and more exhausting than it has ever been before. That exhaustion is not weakness. That exhaustion is the cost of trying to stay in an environment your path has already grown beyond. The room has not changed. That is the part that confuses most people. The room is exactly what it always was. The community holds the same values it always held. The family structure operates by the same logic it always operated by. The professional context rewards the same things it always rewarded. Nothing in the room has shifted. Only your frequency has shifted. And a room calibrated to a frequency you are no longer running cannot hold you correctly, no matter how long you stood comfortably inside it before. The stranger feeling is not a sign of ingratitude. It is not a sign of arrogance. It is the perceptual consequence of a path that has moved past the room's range. You are not too good for the room. You are no longer the same distance from the room's walls that you once were. The fourth thing is the relational misunderstanding that begins to feel systemic. You try to explain where you are. You use honest language. You describe what you are going through as accurately as you can, and the people listening hear the words but do not feel the transmission. They offer responses that are caring, but off-register. They suggest solutions that applied to an older version of you. They reflect back a version of your experience that is technically close, but fundamentally not what you are trying to share. And you begin to wonder whether you are communicating incorrectly, whether you are too complicated, whether the depth you are trying to reach in conversation is simply not available to you. But the reason the communication is not landing is not because you are failing to communicate. It is because the frequency of what you are trying to share has moved past the frequency of the field you are trying to share it in. You are not too complicated. You are too far along for where you are standing. The loneliness produced by this particular mismatch is a very specific kind. It is not the loneliness of having no one around. It is the loneliness of being around people and still not being reached, of receiving warmth that does not penetrate, of being visible and still, somehow unseen. This is the loneliness that a selected line generates when it has moved past the comprehension range of its surrounding field. It cannot be resolved by more contact. It cannot be resolved by better explanation. It can only be resolved by a field that is running at a compatible frequency. And that field has not yet assembled around the path, because the path is still inside the interval, still inside the corridor, still in the phase where what was incompatible has been removed and what is compatible has not yet arrived. The fifth thing the separation does is the one that breaks most people who do not have a framework for it. It arrives as the absence of forward motion precisely when all the old structures have fallen away. The old circle is gone. The old environment no longer holds. The old identity no longer fits. And the new path, the direction all this pruning was supposedly preparing, has not yet become visible. This is the interval. This is the phase where the selected line is present but not yet coherent, where the preparation is complete, but the opening has not yet formed, where everything that was not sustainable has been removed, and nothing that is sustainable has yet appeared to replace it. In this interval, the separation feels most like failure, because there is nothing yet to point to as proof that the removal served a purpose. The branches are gone. The fruit has not yet come. And the tree, stripped and exposed, must sustain itself on something it cannot yet see. The Arcturian understanding of this interval is precise. It is not a mistake. It is not a delay caused by inadequacy. It is a necessary phase of any selected line, the phase in which the path must become willing to sustain itself without external validation, without the social scaffolding that once provided a sense of direction, without the comfort of belonging to something that confirms the path is real. The interval tests whether the path can hold itself, because a selected line that requires constant external confirmation in order to remain viable is a line that is still dependent on the very environment it has been separated from. The interval removes that dependency by removing its source. What survives the interval is not what was strongest in the old environment. What survives the interval is what belongs to the new one. The interval has a specific texture that those inside it will recognize immediately. It is not dramatic. It is quiet, in a way that feels wrong. Other people's lives appear to be in motion. Visible progress, visible connection, visible belonging, while your own appears suspended, paused, stripped of the markers that once signaled forward movement. And in that suspension, the mind generates a very particular narrative, that you fell behind, that something you should have built or maintained or held onto slipped through. And now you are paying the cost of the slip. But the Arcturian reading of that suspension is different. The suspension is not falling behind. The suspension is the interval doing its work. The path is not paused. The path is being cleared. And clearance does not look like motion. It looks like stillness, until suddenly it does not. The sixth sign that a selected line is active is not a feeling of expansion. It is a feeling of precision. The sense that your life, which once felt wide and social and full of possibility, is narrowing in a direction you cannot yet fully see. The friendships that remain are fewer but more specific. The interests that sustain you are fewer but more consistent. The conversations that feel alive are rarer but more necessary. What once felt like a broad and open field is beginning to feel like a corridor. And corridors are not comfortable. They do not offer the lateral movement that open fields do. But corridors have direction. And direction, for a selected line entering its opening phase, is precisely what has been missing. What feels like your life getting smaller may actually be your path getting clearer. The narrowing is the selection mechanism made visible. An open field offers infinite direction and therefore no direction. A corridor offers constrained movement and therefore specific destination. The discomfort of the narrowing is the discomfort of direction imposing itself. It removes the option of lateral drift. The ability to wander into social structures or relational patterns that feel comfortable in the moment, but do not serve the line's actual trajectory. What the narrowing takes away in comfort, it returns in clarity. And clarity. For a path that has been moving without clear direction for long enough arrives not as relief, but as pressure. The pressure of knowing, without yet being able to name exactly where you are supposed to be going. The seventh recognition is the one that requires the most courage to receive. What if the rejection was never about you? Not as comfort, not as reassurance, as a structural truth. What if the people who left were not reading you correctly enough to reject you meaningfully? What if the environments that excluded you were not accurate assessors of your value? What if the distance you have been experiencing was not a verdict from the world about who you are, but a symptom of a path moving faster than the world around it could accommodate. Rejection as a verdict requires that the source of the rejection understood what it was rejecting. But when a selected line separates from an older environment, the older environment does not have the frequency to read what is leaving. It does not understand the departure. It only registers the gap. And so the separation does not arrive as rejection from something that knew you fully. It arrives as distance from something that could no longer hold you and did not have the awareness to know the difference. Consider what it would mean to receive that structurally rather than emotionally, not as permission to dismiss the people who left or the environments that excluded you, but as a recalibration of what their departure actually measured. They were not measuring your worth. They were measuring the distance between your frequency and theirs. And distance is not a verdict. Distance is a reading. A thermometer does not judge the room it measures. It simply reports a number. What left your life was reporting a number. The number of the gap between where you were going and where the field around you was staying. That number was not a rejection. It was a measurement. And measurements, unlike verdicts, carry no punishment. They carry only information. This is what the Arcturian frame does, that no other frame can do cleanly. It moves the locus of interpretation from personal defect to path mechanics. It does not tell you that you are chosen in order to flatter you. It tells you that you are on a selected line in order to give the pattern a name that matches what you are actually experiencing. The losses are real. The loneliness is real. The distance is real. But the cause is not what you have been telling yourself in the moments when you could not sleep and the silence felt permanent. You were not left because you are too much. You were not isolated because you are fundamentally unlovable. You are not repeatedly misunderstood because you are broken in some way that cannot be repaired. You are separated because the line your path is moving along has a frequency that the older field could not sustain indefinitely. The pruning was not personal. The incompatibility was structural. The interval is not punishment. It is the corridor before the opening, and the opening cannot form until the corridor has been walked. Say this if you are ready to receive it without immediately dismantling it with self-doubt. Say it once, aloud or internally, wherever you are hearing this. I was not discarded. I was separated. Not because it resolves everything, not because it makes the loneliness disappear, but because the name you give the process determines how you walk through it. And you cannot walk correctly through a separation phase if you are still calling it a failure. The Arcturians do not view the current phase of your path as a place where something went wrong. They view it as a place where something already went right. So right that the older environment could no longer contain it. So right that the branches had to come off. So right that the corridor had to narrow. So right that the confirmation could only be sent now, after the field had matured past the threshold of doubt that once kept it sealed. What has been narrowing is not closing. It is selecting. What has been removed was not stolen from you. It was separated from you. And there is a difference between what is taken and what is released, between what is lost and what is prepared, between what ends and what clears. The separation is not the end of your path. It is the first visible evidence that your path has a direction. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this separation has already touched your life. It could be people falling away, the feeling of not belonging, repeated distance, unexplained isolation, or the sense that your old path no longer fits. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognized something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who feels alone, cut off, or misunderstood and cannot explain why. And if you are ready to understand the separation, instead of blaming yourself, subscribe to Arcturian Chosen Path. You are not watching this by accident. You are recognizing a path already in motion. And this is only the beginning.